What's the number?
16.
I can't believe you're rolling for him.
How else is he gonna play?
Letting him GM was a mistake.
Through the door enters an ogre.
And here he goes.
A dragon ogre.
Wait for it.
An undead dragon ogre ooze.
He's trying to kill us.
Yeah, DV, what are you doing?
Roll for initiative. Roll for the dragon ogre.
No.
Oh,
Yes! Yes!
The undead dragon ogre ooze has achieved complete surprise and shall attack first.
How? You rolled low, we rolled high. End of story.
The dragon ogre ooze gets a +10 to all initiative rolls. All who face him suffer a -7 penalty due to fear factor.
oh, -7 on a D6. That's convenient.
Did he always play like this?
Yes.
Sometimes, I wish I had never pointed him out to you in that comic shop.
For all the good it did me, taken home by Collector Boy and his Skeletor-obsessed brother.
Skeletor tried to include you.
The ogre attacks with his fiery breath.
I don't believe this. Fire-breathing ogre? Is this for real?
Roll the attack.
14.
The thief is incinerated.
Wait a second, I'm the thief!
And he gets a saving throw. At first level, a thief needs a 16 or better against breath attacks.
Fine.
17. I save.
And take 1d10 damage +5.
I've only got 4 hit points.
The thief is dead. The rest of you must roll saving throws or be wounded by the surrounding flames.
This is a joke.
Stop whining like a bunch of nerds.
Says the only guy wearing a cloak.
Why do you always do this?
Because he's a petty little toy.
On the contrary, when I met you, I was but a figure. Now I am the Dungeon Master.
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Back was the collector, he's protecting what we find. Relentless heavy metal guns keep us safe through time. RetroBlasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind, RetroBlasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. We're blasting into the past to see what thrill still lasts. RetroBlasting.
It wasn't a cartoon that exactly had toys I could buy. I can't say I rushed downstairs to watch it on Saturday mornings. No one can claim it was the most popular cartoon in the 1980s, but it might just be the best cartoon of the decade. Unlike other 1980s cartoons that were based on toy lines, video games, and even greeting cards, Dungeons & Dragons was adapted from the popular but controversial role-playing game created by Gary Gygax. How close was it to the actual game? Did the controversy around the game result in no direct toy tie-in? What place in 1980s history does the cartoon Dungeons & Dragons occupy, and what impact did it have? In order to get the answers to these questions, I knew I couldn't go it alone. I needed an expert, and I couldn't think of a better resource than my own brother. Jonathan grew up loving sword and sorcery. He preferred He-Man figures, he read Conan comics, and he's collected a library of role-playing games as an adult. He and I played Dungeons & Dragons all the time in middle school, and he's since become a fantasy author himself.
At the time that the cartoon came out, which I believe it launched in 1983, Dungeons & Dragons was going through a very aggressive rebranding. The game had existed for, I think, almost 10 years at this point, in one form or another. And in 77, they had actually split the game into 2 lines, essentially what they called the basic game and advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So you're looking at by, 83, those 2 brands have been coexisting for 6 years. But the basic game in 82, 83 got a reskinning. The artwork was redone. Of course, Larry Elmore, the now famous red box, which has become almost D&D's most iconic image, I would say. D&D had become an American cultural icon in a relatively short time. There had been a scene regarding D&D in the movie E.T. So when you put Dungeons and Dragons in a movie like that, you're clearly recognizing that it is no longer some obscure thing. It had name recognition and people knew what it was. I don't think it's an accident that they were able to get a cartoon at that moment. When the show hit, I think it's safe to say that even though D&D had some I think it had some Apple II video games, but this is the early 80s. Video games weren't as prevalent in households as they are now. And of course, it's the 80s. The fantasy cartoons are not unheard of, right? I mean, Black Star, Masters of the Universe. Fantasy cartoons aren't hard to make. And from what I understand, the original script for D&D was actually called Sword and Sorcery, and it didn't have the branding on it. It was just an idea that the writer had, and he had played the game. But then they were able to actually brand it and get the license and get the rights. And one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax, is listed as a co-producer.
Dungeons & Dragons hit 1980s televisions on Saturday morning in 1983. The series told the story of 6 teenagers that are pulled into another world while riding the Dungeons & Dragons ride at a theme park. They find themselves in medieval clothing in a strange world of dragons, wizards, and warriors, and look for a way home in each episode. They are aided by the very Yoda-like character of Dungeon Master, who gives them magic weapons to aid them in their journey. Hank is called the Ranger and given an energy bow. Bobby is given a magic club and dubbed the Barbarian.
He's the littlest one, he's the youngest one, but he charges in every time.
You don't scare me!
Presto is granted a magic hat and named the Magician. Sheila is robed in an invisibility cloak as the Thief. Eric is given a magic shield and named the Cavalier, and Diana is given a glowing javelin and called the Acrobat.
Uni, the unicorn, is legitimately cute. The animal sidekick was not obnoxious. She's a baby unicorn and she works.
One of the subplots in the show involves Bobby's obsession with keeping Uni safe, and sometimes it borders on creepy.
If anything ever happened to you,
There's just one catch. Dungeon Master just handed them a pile of magic weapons that are wanted by the most evil sorcerer in the realm, Venger, who looks surprisingly like Satan in a dress. So now they're not only lost, they're on the run. Not to mention that by episode 3, their weapons all need recharging at a mystic temple. You'd think Dungeon Master would have checked the batteries on those things before doling them out. The first thing you can't help but notice about the series is that unlike almost all the other cartoons in the 80s, Dungeons & Dragons doesn't have an opening theme song to get you pumped up. Instead, the opening sequence is used to rapidly establish how the kids are pulled into the other world, where Dungeon Master appears out of nowhere and gives them the weapons to fight the dragon Tiamat, while protecting their new baby unicorn companion, Uni. It's a rapid-fire sequence and a clever use of time. As a result, Dungeons & Dragons has no pilot episode to establish the series. The first episode is all business.
You can't tell if they've been there 2 minutes or 2 days or 2 weeks. You really don't know. It just kind of jumps right in.
The characters are all distinct, which is helpful. In a number of cartoons from the 80s, groups of characters can end up being very similar, so they're hard to distinguish from one another. Not so with Dungeons & Dragons. Each character has a distinct personality that motivates their actions. Hank struggles with the responsibility of leadership. Sheila worries about keeping her brother safe. Bobby is headstrong and has a bit of an angry streak. Diana is an athlete and finds innovative ways to solve problems. Eric is the rich kid who never sides with the rest of the group and would sooner find his own way. Presto is the nerdy kid with a penchant for spells. Each character is given a surprising amount of development across the 27 episodes, and the writing holds up extremely well most of the time. In the episode Quest of the Skeleton Warrior, an undead knight is trying to redeem himself for betraying his comrades in ages past and getting them all killed. He's made a deal with the devil, in this case Venger, and soon will be forced to betray the heroes, to kill a second time to save himself. One episode is about as scary as they get, when Bobby is abducted in his sleep by an unseen force and pulled into another dimension with scores of other stolen children who are being forced by a massive demon to keep the wheels of time from ever reaching 12 o'clock. In another episode, the kids are led to believe Hank has betrayed them to Venger. The character interplay is quite dynamic by 1980s standards and results in compelling stories. Amid the excellent episodes are some annoying logic problems. Why does everyone have a normal name except Presto? His name is allegedly Albert, but no one calls him that. Then you have Eric, who is given full armor and knightly regalia, but is only given a shield to use. I'm constantly wondering why he doesn't commandeer a sword somewhere just to have something to fight back with. I'm assuming it's due to restrictions on violence in cartoons at the time, but there are numerous instances of other characters using swords on the show, so I'm stumped.
Eric bothered me as a kid because of that. He's got a shield but no weapon, and he bothered me as an adult because he is sort of one-note, obnoxious comic relief.
And all those in favor of my being the new leader, raise your hands.
But what's even more frustrating is that shield is super powerful, and he hardly ever uses it. They established that he can create a force field with it and all that, and he just never does. He always hides, runs, falls. I think that's the worst part now. It's just like, it's not so much that he doesn't have a weapon, it's that the weapon that he's got, he doesn't use.
As the show progresses, the writers start playing fast and loose with Hank's energy bow. It goes from the group's only ranged weapon to the turnkey solution for almost any situation. On command, it can create cushions to break a fall, or a bridge across a chasm, or a sky sled to yank someone out of harm's way. And while I understand that if Sheila used her invisibility cloak all the time, there'd never be a character to animate, it does bug me that she constantly sneaks into enemy lairs with her hood down, and only uses the invisibility when the bad guys are almost around the corner. But those are really the only gripes. The scripting of the series is extremely strong.
I am most fascinated by Diana. I think 80s cartoons were in this weird meeting to try to get girls interested in pole vaulting. Because we have Chitara, who has a staff that grows, and then we've got Diana, and then even Tila, to a degree, in the action figure had a staff. It's like, whoop. So Diana, we had a black woman hero character, which is pretty rare. Even today, that's rare. But not only do you have it, but she's done correctly.
How are we gonna get them away from Godzilla?
Wait, remember what Dungeon Master said? By helping the one who stands against you.
She's charismatic, she's competent, and she holds her own. And anytime she does something, you're interested because it's not even obvious. Diana has what they call a javelin, and she's using her natural abilities. They set up that she was already a gymnast in her own time period. So is it the weapon, or is it just her natural prowess with this unbreakable javelin, right?
Maybe that monster's bite is poisonous.
I hope there's a cure.
Wow, that's convenient.
I was shocked at how well it held up, and in some ways shattered my memory of it. Because, again, it was an enjoyable show, but my imagination was better. My characters, when I was playing D&D with you and our other friends in the 80s, was just better than the show. But in a lot of ways, at first, when you first start watching it, it's like, this is Scooby-Doo with a better setting and a better cast, right? Less annoying characters and just a cooler world. But then the more you get into it, it is surprisingly solid.
There's not really much of an evolving story aside from the misadventure of the week, but the writers try to infuse the series with hints of metaplot. At one point in the series, there's a suggestion that Venger may be Dungeon Master's greatest mistake.
There are heavy references that there's a major connection between him and the villain of the show, Venger, that there's a bond there that was going to be explored.
There was good in Venger once. Everyone makes mistakes. Venger was mine.
The relationship between the heroes and Dungeon Master goes from comical to contentious.
He says in the opening credit sequence, "I'm your guide," but he always talks in riddles and he very rarely leads them anywhere.
Sometimes by looking back, you can see a clearer path through what lies ahead.
Oh, brother, here he goes again.
He has limits, and he doesn't really do anything himself, and he needs agents. I don't think he's a master of any one dungeon, because obviously he's leading them through an entire world, and they're very rarely in dungeons when he shows up. He mostly shows up in the wilderness, which is kind of interesting. He tells them, "I'm here to help you get home," but it's clear that he's using them.
At first, Dungeon Master is much like Gandalf. He pops in, gives them a dangerous task, says some cryptic things, and disappears. But that morphs into frustration, and soon everyone in the group shares Eric's annoyance with this pattern.
There's an awesome moment where Dungeon Master realizes he's lost control, he's completely disappointed, he's a little worried, but they kind of turn on him. And that episode really shows that he does have a master plan, but he's not in complete control. They're not puppets. He's not railroading them, which is something a bad Dungeon Master does.
Their refusal to continually show Dungeon Master blind obedience is an unusual development for a 1980s cartoon, an era in which we were taught to trust our mentors. In the series' most powerful episode, The Dragon's Graveyard, the heroes reject Dungeon Master's next mission and vow to take down Venger once and for all.
We see in that episode that he really doesn't have complete control. They do have control of their own decisions. And that's a crazy good episode.
The episode was almost pulled from production due to the inferred violence. The heroes defeat Venger by making an alliance with the dragon Tiamat, but stop short at actually killing him. I think this is the only Saturday morning cartoon of the 1980s in which the characters attempt to kill off their nemesis while rejecting their mentor's advice. However, Dungeon Master gives as good as he gets. In Dungeon at the Heart of Dawn, Eric ignores Dungeon Master's warnings and opens a forbidden chest that brings an unstoppable evil into the realm. Dungeon Master wastes no time chastising Eric for his folly.
We are running, Cavalier, for our very lives.
And extends the blame to Hank for shirking his duty as leader of the group.
I guess apologies won't make any difference now.
Even at its lowest creative points, Dungeons & Dragons still manages to stand a step above other shows. In The Time Lost, Venger brings a Nazi pilot back from the past to take a futuristic jet fighter to World War II and allow Hitler to win the war, but the heroes intercept the pilot first and learn he's conveniently sick of the war and the Nazi cause. While it's somewhat uncomfortable to watch a 1940s Nazi fall for Diana, the idea behind the plot is reminiscent of classic Star Trek episodes. In the episode The Traitor, we're subjected to an adventure with the Cloud Bears, who are just Ewok ripoffs with a dash of Care Bears thrown in for good measure. They even live in massive tree villages identical to the forests of Endor. But even within this terrible context, the interplay between the characters is magnetic. The heroes believe that Hank has betrayed them to Venger, and it looks like he may actually have done so. The fracturing of the group is palpable, and it really shows how devious Venger is as a villain. Voiced by Peter Cullen, Venger is about as sinister a bad guy as one could ask for. Even when other monsters do horrible things, all of them cower before Venger's presence. You might be evil enough to maim a baby unicorn, but you'll still quake in your boots in front of Venger, or pay the price for your attempted treachery.
He's Optimus Prime as evil.
Indeed.
I mean, and as a demon with one horn and wings. He's interesting. I think the only thing that bugs me about him is that he flies, but he rides a horse to do it, even though the wings are his. So I always have this weird idea that he's got to really hold on with his thighs to keep the horse in the air. You know, it's almost like he's like gripping the barrel of the animal, and then he's the one lifting it. So it's like, why do you even need it? Why are you riding a horse? But no, he's got cool white energy blasts. He always has, he has a shadow demon. He's not all that dastardly in that he's murderous. He really just wants the artifacts of power. He wants the weapons that the kids have. So they're more just an annoying gatekeeper that he's trying to get through. And several times he's even said it. Give me the weapons and you can leave.
Give me your weapons and I will leave you in peace.
He has no interest in ever really doing away with them, unless doing away with them is the easiest way to get the weapons at that moment.
Dungeons & Dragons took risks other shows weren't even close to considering. You'd think the writers would be more cautious given the negative attention that was already being placed on the source property. Parents groups were already decrying Dungeons & Dragons the role-playing game as satanic, but the writers just kept pushing the envelope on the cartoon.
D&D as a game and as the cartoon specifically having any type of controversy associated with it back in the day or now as to being satanic or evil or ultra-violent or leading kids down a dark path. And I still think, we still know there are people who burn copies of Harry Potter, so I'm sure there are people that would still take issue with the Dungeons & Dragons show exactly as it is. And that's really too bad because there's a lot there to learn and to expose kids to. And there is a lot of talk lately of we're pandering so much that we're raising generations of victims. And maybe I'm putting too fine a point on it, but that's one thing that those kids in D&D are not. They are not victims. Like they have their weak moments, but they rise to their challenges and they do it with a maturity and a grace that I wish we saw in kids today. I think it's too bad that all people see sometimes, certain people, is a veneer. Oh, they're using the word demon. They're using the word dragon. They're using the word magic. That's not okay. That's amoral or immoral. So I think if people could only see past that, they'd see a real gem there.
There's been a lot of analysis about the idea that the show promotes a groupthink message because Eric is always overruled by the others, that the series pushes an anti-individualism agenda. I tend to disregard this as a bit paranoid. If you're pulled into a magical realm of demons and evil wizards, and your first thought is to break away from the rest of the group and strike out on your own, your decision-making skills are at best questionable. Yeah, Dungeon Master's jerking you around and your friends are acting like chumps, but until you have your own magic sword or energy bow, safety is in numbers. By all rights, I shouldn't like this series. I don't like shows with kid heroes, and I don't like shows with a Gilligan's Island premise. Dungeons & Dragons has both, but it succeeds in winning me over because the writing and characters are so strong. The writers bring out the best elements of this kind of premise, not the worst. The kids only act like kids far enough to keep things credible, but not so far as to make every interaction obnoxious.
There's so much equality in the show because they just ignore it, right? There's never a moment where Sheila and Diana being girls, right? And it's not hit over the head feminism or anything. They're just heroes in the party, just as capable, just as competent, right? There's never any, I mean, they save their male counterparts just as often as they're saved. Diana is black. It's ignored. It's just, that's her skin color, done. I mean, there's just this shocking amount of just refreshing even keel about it. And there is no, winks or hyperbole about any of it. It's not like, oh, we put in these characters to be diverse, or it's just done, right?
Sadly, the show's search for home premise worked against it. In a few episodes, they make it home, only to find themselves forced to return because of some moral imperative.
Several times in the show, they almost do it. And what changes is the reason why they can't. Several times, in fact, a few times, they even get back. They physically return. And then there's a heroic choice that usually has to be made, or a consequence that they're going to have if they stay. And it's usually, do we be selfish and stay home, or do we be heroes and go back? And they choose to be heroes every time. And I think that's huge. I think that's the soul of the show. I love Masters of the Universe, but does it have that definitive of a message? I mean, it had a message at the end of every show, but did it have that sort of through line message? Not one that's easy to pin down the way D&D does. And that is, we want to get home, but we're not willing to do that without making sure that the world we leave is okay.
Much like Jason the Wheeled Warriors, the show was canceled before the plot could wrap up. The bigger sting is that Dungeons & Dragons was only one episode away from completion. The network pulled the plug before the final episode, which now only exists as a screenplay and a radio show bonus feature on the original DVD box set.
It's a shame that it didn't go longer than it did, because it doesn't really have an ending, even like it doesn't really have a beginning.
In the final episode, titled Requiem, the kids were to learn about Venger's origins and redeem him from evil before being forced to choose whether to stay in the realm themselves or finally go home.
It's tragic, the fact that they had the last episode scripted. And from what I understand, it wasn't meant to be just a last episode. It was meant to be a really big change. Like, they were going to shake up the way the show was done. So we might have gotten a cast change, or maybe just a tonal change. We don't really know. If you watch the episode called The Girl That Dreamed Tomorrow last, the show ends poetically well. And I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but while they don't really get home, you are left with a perfect wrap-up and an answer that they will.
The original box set from BCI has all of the special features, but it has an incorrect version of the Dragon's Graveyard episode. It has the wrong music behind it. A few years later, Mill Creek put out its own bare-bones release of the complete series, and they included the episode of the Dragon's Graveyard with the correct music, but it has no special features. So if you're a huge Dungeons & Dragons fan, you're going to have to buy both.
We look back on 80s Saturday morning cartoons with a lot of reverence. And the fact that D&D was a title in that kind of blessed group of entertainment, I think is important. And even though it was fairly short-lived, it was there. And so when we look back on the history of the game and the history of the brand, that is a huge feather in the cap, right? It had an 80s cartoon. People still cosplay it, people still love it, and they still wish that there was another one, and we haven't had one, right? So I think it's cool that it was there, and I think that it says a lot about the popularity of the game, and I think it will continue to help the popularity of the game.
Dungeons & Dragons also shares a second unfortunate trait with Jason the Wheeled Warriors. In addition to relying on open-ended plotting, a search for home, a search for a father, the shows also find themselves terminally disconnected from their own merchandising. Where is Skeletor anyway? I was hoping to say hi.
Yeah, he's out. The action figure arm wrestling championships were today.
Nice.